Welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun-jung Cho. 5 years after announcing it has completed the state nuclear force, North Korea has codified its nuclear doctrine and further developed its nuclear capabilities. The leaders of the U.S. and South Korea are calling on China to play a constructive role in restraining North Korea. On the program today, we have Mr. Daniel Russel joining us via Skype and Mr. Dennis Wilder in the studio with me to discuss how China impacts the developments on the Korean Peninsula.
Even as we continue to respond to these missile tests with closer trilateral security and military cooperation, closer intelligence cooperation.
북한 사회에 군사적으로나 경제적으로 상당한 영향을 줄 수 있는 그런 능력이 있다고 저는 생각합니다.
From our perspective, we do not see this as a zero-sum game.
Now joining us via Skype, Mr. Daniel Russel, Vice President for International Security and Diplomacy at the Asia Society Policy Institute. Mr. Russel served as the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. He was also Senior Director for Asian Affairs at the National Security Council during the Obama administration. In the studio with me, Mr. Dennis Wilder, professor at Georgetown University. Mr. Wilder was Senior Director for East Asian Affairs at the National Security Council during the George W. Bush administration. He was also CIA's Deputy Assistant Director for East Asia and the Pacific. Welcome to the program.
Thanks so much. Glad to be here.
Thank you. Mr. Russell, welcome to the program.
Thanks. Glad to join you and my old friend Dennis Wilder.
Good to see you, Danny.
Right. In 2017, Mr. Russell, North Korea declared it has completed its nuclear weapons system. Now, looking at the broad direction that it is going, what is the key takeaway in terms of North Korea's nuclear and missile developments the past 5 years?
The key is that it's not stopping. At the time that Kim Jong-un declared the nuclear program complete, he also asserted that he was going to continue to develop an ever more massive arsenal. And unfortunately, he's been true to his word. North Korea has continued to manufacture not only nuclear weapons, but increasingly capable delivery vehicles, including ballistic missiles. And that's cause for great concern. I think there is no question about Kim Jong-un's strategy. That strategy does not include negotiations or denuclearization. That strategy is to massively threaten the Republic of Korea, the United States, Japan, and extract concessions along the way.
Now, Professor Wilder, North Korea this year codified in law its right to launch preemptive nuclear strikes and forward deployed tactical nuclear weapons and keeps on testing its ICBMs. So what is Kim Jong-un's Korean war strategy looking at all these developments?
Well, it is very worrisome because, as Danny said, there are a lot of developments here, particularly on the ICBM side and the tactical nuclear weapons. What Kim is trying to do, and he hasn't achieved this yet, but it is his goal, is what he calls moving from simply having a trusted shield to having a trusted sword. What we're talking about here is moving from a defensive capability, a second strike capability, to having a first strike capability. So the idea would be that if there was either a conventional attack on North Korea or worries about a conventional or nuclear attack on North Korea, that the North Koreans would launch on warning. This is a particularly dangerous development because we don't think the North Koreans have a very good warning capability, and they could make mistakes. So moving to a first strike capability by the North Koreans is terribly worrisome.
Mr. Russell, during the Obama administration, you were one of the key players in deterring North Korea's nuclear development. But North Korea has declared that it has completed its nuclear weapons system. Now, U.S. experts are talking about risk reduction, about arms control, and not doing denuclearization with North Korea. What did the U.S. do wrong? Where did U.S. fail in stopping North Korea from its nuclear development?
The United States was never able to get China to utilize its tremendous leverage over North Korea to make meaningful contributions to the efforts to halt or roll back, let alone eliminate North Korea's nuclear and ballistic missile programs. We could not get China to take action to enforce the provisions of the Security Council resolutions that they supported. So we've had a failure of the entire international community to utilize all of the key tools to deter North Korea. And where that leaves us is an imperfect network of sanctions, of deterrence, of defense. And so we are doing and have to do the best that we can.
Now, Mr. Wilder, Mr. Russell just talked about how important China can play in deterring North Korea, and that's what President Biden is talking about. That's what South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol recently also said, that China has the capability and the responsibility to restrain North Korea. And if it fails to do so, there will be an influx of military assets in the region. Now, how can we pull China out from its own comfort zone and make it be more proactive in restraining North Korea?
Well, I couldn't agree more with Mr. Russell on the fact that China needs to use its leverage. I think China has made a strategic mistake, and we need to over and over again reiterate and reinforce that message to the Chinese. After all, aligning yourself with a crumbling Russia and a pariah state like North Korea is not going to get China anywhere in the international system. Already what we're seeing is the South Koreans, the Japanese, others in East Asia are moving in the American direction. They're building their defensive capabilities in order to handle this situation in Northeast Asia. Is that what China really wants? Does China really want an arms race in Northeast Asia caused by the North Koreans? I don't think so.
Mr. Russell, other than sending message to Xi Jinping that you got to do more, what can we do to make China more proactive in helping with the North Korean situation?
I think Dennis is pointing to the right answer, namely that the inevitable, I think inexorable response of the United States, along with the Republic of Korea, Japan, and other allies like Australia, will be to deploy forward more defensive assets that, as we know from the THAAD deployment experience, China considers to be threatening to its own national security interests. There's no way around that, given geography and given the magnitude of the North Korean threat. So the closer that the United States, Japan, and the Republic of Korea are working together as security partners, as allies, the stronger the bulwark of defense by major democracies, by the industrial West in Northeast Asia, the more the Chinese are likely to worry. And if that's not a motivation for them to finally yank the leash on Kim Jong-un, then they'll have to endure the consequences.
Now I want to move on to the China factor in the U.S.-South Korea relations. And Mr. Russell, Moon Jae-in administration openly said that it is pursuing security cooperation with the United States and economic cooperation with China, and even called China its strategic partner. Now the Yoon Suk-yeol administration says it is pursuing U.S.-centered foreign policy. Do you think the Yoon Suk-yeol administration's stance is dramatically different from the Moon Jae-in administration, or do you think the Yoon administration need to draw even closer to America?
Well, I think President Yoon learned a great deal from the failed 5-year experiment of the Moon Jae-in administration that had unrealistic hopes for Chinese help in pushing for inter-Korean reconciliation. And the net effect of the Moon strategy, I believe, was that it gave China leverage over South Korea. I think this was really a setback to the Republic of Korea's strategic interests. Now, it seems to me like the Yoon government is determined to deal with China from a position of strength, a position of dignity, not as a supplicant, because they learned that you can't coax China into fulfilling its responsibilities, particularly if you're giving China an opening to exercise leverage. And I think also that the Yoon government has shown that they recognize that security is a combination of national security and economic security, not two different things, so that Korea's ability to put its economic relationship with China on a solid footing actually requires that Beijing understands that Seoul cannot be bullied.
Professor Wilder, NSC Senior Director for East Asia and Oceanian Affairs, Edgar Kagan, said that strong U.S.-South Korea alliance and productive South Korea-China relations is compatible. We were at that event together.
Right.
So, Professor Wilder, is this a feasible goal in an age where security and economic affairs are so intertwined? Is it feasible?
Well, I would point you to what our Secretary of Commerce said earlier this week in a speech at MIT. She was very clear that while we have our problems with China, while we'll do some targeted sanctioning in terms of China's chip manufacturers and other high technology areas, we're not decoupling from the Chinese economy. U.S.-China trade is too big for the United States to consider an economic policy of decoupling. So we're not asking our friends and allies to do that. I think there are very good reasons for the South Korean government and South Korean people to continue to have robust trading relationships with China. Indeed, that gives you some leverage over the Chinese government. So I think that, yes, these two policies can coexist. You can build up South Korea's deterrent capabilities and build up the alliance with the United States, and at the same time have a robust economic relationship.
Mr. Russell, what is your reaction? How should South Korea react to U.S. invitation for a stronger economic alliance? And is U.S. not asking South Korea to decouple from China?
No, I think that, look, every industrialized democracy faces the same paradox. Can you have a productive relationship with China in economics, in trade, in cultural exchange and so on, but also protect yourself against the Chinese behavior that you find threatening or unfair? I think every industrialized country, France, Germany, Japan, the US, the ROK, is experimenting to see whether you can do this. I think that the strong US ROK alliance is a net asset. I think that, as Dennis said, there have been recently some regrettable elements, protectionist elements to U.S. legislation, but that's really apples and oranges, that those measures should be dealt with on their own merits, but trade issues really don't, they don't, for example, affect other cooperative areas like North Korea policy. So I don't see why they should affect technology challenges that we have to contend with from China.
Mm-hmm. In a recent interview, RK President Yoon Suk-yeol made clear that he opposes any attempts to changing the Taiwan status quo unilaterally. Just a couple of years ago, South Korean presidents were not so vocal and clear about the Taiwan situation. So South Korean president being very clear about its stance on Taiwan. How does this help with South Korea's relations with China?
Well, the Chinese, I've learned from experience, will push and push and push until they meet resistance. And they will push the Republic of Korea until the Republic of Korea takes a stand. So if countries censor themselves, if they look the other way when Beijing uses coercive pressure to bully someone else, not only is that situation likely to get worse, but it's really only a matter of time before that sort of pressure is directed at you. So, as I've said, we're all looking for a way to reconcile our desire to cooperate with China and our, very substantial economic and other interests in coexisting and cooperating with China. We are together on the same planet, but we are looking for ways to do that still protect our own rights, our national security, our technology, and our intellectual property. You can't sacrifice the latter in hopes of gaining the former.
Professor Wilder, some say a war between U.S. and China could happen in the next few years, and that's why U.S. would likely grow more intense and urgent in asking its allies to show support for U.S. in the case of Taiwan contingency. What is your reaction to those views?
Well, Jun, I think that the United States' goal, which is the right goal, is to make it clear to Beijing that the cost of any type of military action, coercive or even an invasion of Taiwan, is unacceptable. And the way that we're doing that is through both deterrence policy and diplomacy. So having our allies speak up on this issue is very important. One of the things that has happened recently that's very interesting is that the Taiwan issue has become internationalized. The NATO countries are now speaking up like they never have before. Korea is speaking up. Other nations in the region are speaking up. What we need to do is make it clear to Beijing that there are an awful lot of countries that will come to the aid in the Taiwan situation if China acts in a disastrous, provocative way and actually considers military action against Taiwan.
Now, Mr. Russell, do you think there is a difference in the degree where South Korea and Japan can join in on U.S. policy on China? Prime Minister Kishida recently said that Japan will increase its defense budget to 2% of its GDP. Do you think South Korea should also beef up its defense budget in light of more heightened provocations from North Korea?
Well, there is certainly a rationale in North Korea's threat for the government in Korea to continue investing heavily in its own defense. What the precise level of defense spending should be isn't really for me to say. But more broadly, I don't see why there should be a difference in Korea's political approach to the challenge posed by China than there is in Japan's. I mean, if in fact Korea, as I believe, is really a global actor. As I've said, we've all got economic interests in China, so there's nothing unique about that to the Republic of Korea. I think in the past, the only rationale for South Korea holding back in dealing with China was the hope that China might agree to play a constructive role in managing the DPRK, that it would use its tremendous leverage over Pyongyang to push for denuclearization, for inter-Korean rapprochement, for reform. But look, we now know that that was not going to happen, that it was a pipe dream. And it's even clearer that today, under Xi Jinping, it's even less likely than it might have been in the past. So I don't think that there is a rationale for Seoul failing to be outspoken, for Seoul taking a different geopolitical position although certainly the circumstances of the ROK being so directly threatened by the DPRK are going to shape the character of its defense and its defense budget.
Mr. Russell, you said you don't see any rationale why South Korea should be any different from Japan in voicing its opinion against China, but South Korea is much geographically closer to China than Japan and can get retaliated much severely because it's more economically intertwined with China than as opposed to Japan.
Well, I think in this era, the old-fashioned geography of the 20th century or the 19th century may not apply. And not only is Japan very directly threatened by China in the East China Sea in the Senkaku Diaoyu area, where there's a constant sortie of PLA, of Chinese military ships and fighters challenging Japan's administrative control. But Japan is also being directly threatened by the DPRK, by North Korean missiles that have overflown Japan that routinely land in the Sea of Japan. So I think that there may be differences in degree, but the fundamentals are the same for all of us. We are all threatened by China's effort to gain technological dominance. We're all threatened by China's wholesale theft of our intellectual property. And we're all deeply disturbed as democracies, as open societies, by China's authoritarian practices and behaviors. So there's every reason to make common cause. And I don't think there's a real justification for any one country to exempt itself from the collaborative effort. I think Dennis Welder made this incredibly important point. Deterrence is built on Beijing recognizing unity in the international community, strong and consistent opposition across the board to aggression, to coercion, and to disruption of the peace and stability of the region that we all live in.
Now, Professor Wilder, before we go, China Military Power Report 2022 talked about how Chinese military are doing exercises involving carrier navigation, flight training, unmanned aircraft systems, all in the case of Korean contingency. Do you think in reaction, South Korea should also prepare military posture against possible PLA action on the Korean Peninsula and military aggression to the peninsula?
Well, again, I think that what we're seeing here is another strategic mistake by the Chinese. The idea of operating jointly with the Russians in the areas of the Korean air defense identification zone is simply ridiculous. They are not going to be partners in some sort of action within the region. It's a bluff by the Chinese and by the Russians. They're trying to show strength where there isn't strength. And so I think we don't need to take too seriously these kinds of demonstrations by the Chinese Air Force and the Russian Air Force. Obviously, they're trying to send signals in some ways. They're trying to bully the South Koreans, bully the Japanese by these kinds of efforts, and we should push back against them.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. Professor Wilder and Mr. Russell, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. We'll be back here next week with U.S. experts to discuss the two Koreas and the region right here from Washington.